Yeah, so welcome, guys. So before we started recording, I was talking to Brendan about the success that Mike's had and what types of players he's recruiting to continue to build on that success and that sort of thing. Brendan, you want to kind of jump in and help me ask the right question here?
Sure. I think one of the
Yeah.
most interesting things, based on where we are with match play and some of the discussions we've had, is as college coaches, a lot of times the stuff you can see on the field is fairly straightforward in terms of evaluation. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it means you can tell if someone's fast, you can tell if someone's strong, you can tell if they can score in pressure situations. The things that are harder to evaluate are the things that may happen, off the field in your program, or the things that kind of make your program cohesive and that make your group a little more than the sum of its parts. And so I think the most interesting conversations that we've had, Mike, in the past have dealt with how you evaluate or how you figure out from maybe a limited number of contacts with a particular player that you're recruiting. How do you try to get at some of those qualities? Like, what are the qualities that you think are things you prioritize in terms of not just soccer stuff? And then maybe a little bit about how you try to get at some of those things and try to evaluate some of those things, given the limitations we have in terms of recruiting rules.
Right, right. Well, that's one thing. Like, I put a really high stock in the personality of the people we bring in here. 'Cause I always say it's one apple ruins the whole bushel, and it's really important for us to make sure that our team is enjoying each other, both on and off the field. And I think a team that enjoys each other off the field typically plays better on the field. So I think it's very harmonious when we look at the off the field and on the field stuff. But through the process, there's a few things that we do to try to pull out some of these factors. And some of the things that we put a high stock on are hunger. I want somebody who has a growth mindset, and I want somebody who is going to go after it and try to make it happen. Isn't just going to be sitting there waiting for it to happen for them. And when I see that people exhibit that hunger on the field, then it jumps out at me right away. And then if I can see that they have sort of that strong competitive drive, then we pose questions at them, quite honestly, in hopes of seeing how they respond to it. Just as simple as can be. But when I watch people play, I do give them feedback, and I do give them constructive feedback as well. And I've had a wide array of responses to that. Some people thinking that everything they do is good, and they couldn't believe that I didn't like something they did. And then other people saying thanks so much. And one guy who was a 2-year captain here, he came back 7 months after I had given him that feedback in another tournament. And as I was watching him play, he ran off the field and he railed off the 3 points I gave him and asked me if I thought he had done a better job on those three things. And I'm like, okay, he's someone I want on my team. And it turned out he was a 2-year captain, but he was really a 4-year captain because he was always talking and leading and was a very responsible young man on the team. But so it starts with really giving that feedback and seeing how they take it. Then there's things that we talk about as well. And I say very openly when people are visiting campus here, I say to them, look, the last game of your senior year, I'm going to be asking you to get better. If you're not comfortable with that, don't come here. And I stare them straight in the eye when I say it. It's to see how they're absorbing it and how they're adjusting to it, because it is something I want them to understand, that as competitive people, we're always competitive. It's not something you turn on and off. And I share with them that I win so many races on highways against cars that don't know they're racing against me, because that's how competitive I am. I'm always wanting to sort of figure out a way to win something. And we talk a lot about that with our recruits, of just think about how is it if you play on a team when everybody is like-minded that way. And where these guys come from with their clubs, there's varied motivations and varied backgrounds of where they're coming. So that's a selling point that we sell to recruits as well, is understanding that, hey, you're going to be with everyone on the team is similarly minded in this way. They're going to be pushing each other constantly. And I task it to the players to have them be doing that to each other, because NCAA rules prohibit us from working with players so often in the year. So
Yeah.
that's the biggest things for us is really making sure that, one, they're hungry, and two, they're pushed to compete constantly in everything they do, and that's both on and off the field. And understanding to get in here, they have to be really driven academically and had a lot of success academically. So usually if they're in the ballpark to getting in here, I know they've done good work in that domain. But then we have an open talk with them when they do get here and tell them that when you come to college and you play a sport, you lose your first name. And they're like, what do you mean by that? I'm like, well, your name becomes that soccer player, ... Because whatever you do, it is good or bad on campus, you will be referred to as that soccer player, and every one of your teammates and coaches and alums will be colored in the same way that you were just framed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a responsibility and a huge responsibility they carry. But I think it's true. And typically when people have shown that they're very, say, hungry and driven and competitive, they get that, because they also don't want to have somebody else just do something to make them look bad, knowing that they're going to get the same sort of negativity if it happens, if one of their teammates does something bad. So it kind of gives them a little bit more responsibility, and I like that they take that responsibility seriously. The other thing I do tell my players too, which is interesting, is if they do make a mistake while they're here, I ask them to tell me first. Now, it's odd because they get 3 strikes when they're here. If you get 3 strikes, you're cut from the team, and I won't recommend you go for any other program. And so if they do something wrong, they know they're getting a strike. But at the same point, they're tasked with telling me first, because if I hear it from a dean or I hear it from campus security or someone else, there's nothing I can do for them, and there's no way I can help them. So that's part of the responsibility when they come in too, is understanding that, hey, we're all going to make mistakes. I'm not going to belabor the mistake, but if we make a mistake, we have to figure out how to do the best after we do so to not make it compounded. And if you come to me first, then we can talk about that, and we can talk proactively about the steps you should take to minimize the damage that you do. But if you don't, and you try to hide it from me, well, that's going to hurt the program a lot more. And that's where we're going to be a little bit more upset. And you're going to have to rectify it with your teammates, because then you've done extra work to hurt their reputation as well.
So you talked about in our programs, I was at William and Mary for a while, and our programs have a lot of similarities in terms of the difficulty of getting in and the high expectations once you get there. And as coaches, a lot of times we make some assumptions when you have somebody who gets into school and who has been performing at a high level on the field as well. They've done really well academically and athletically throughout their youth career. Maybe you feel like I'm not going to have to worry about this guy, or you maybe feel like you can take your foot off the gas a little bit in terms of monitoring them and supervising them and what we might call hand holding. When you get new players into your program, so this is something that I think about a lot with the guys that I've recruited as well. What type of things do you see that, and not necessarily that they have to be, it's like a huge negative quality or anything, but where are the course or the guidance? Where do you have to apply the most guidance early in a player's career when they first get to Washington and Lee?
Mm-hmm. Well, it starts before they even get here, quite honestly, because they're assigned mentors months before they arrive on campus. And we have a mentor guidebook that's a living document that we've made up with captains for a long time now. It keeps getting updated. And those mentors are charged with having phone contact with the incomers at least every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the entire summer, essentially from May to August. So it kind of starts there. The other thing that we do that we try to impress upon them is during preseason, the first years are in charge of all our social media accounts, and they have to post at least once a day on all accounts. And I will tell you, it's very interesting. They get nervous about it, they get worried about it, but they ride into it. What I didn't expect is that on our team Twitter account, we would now be getting updates from all these female players committing everywhere and everyone they had looked at when they were on the Twitter account. It's kind of those unexpected consequences, but it was good because it gets them to understand they have that responsibility. And that's the biggest thing that I want to impart upon them, is that they're now involved in something bigger than themselves. They can still be an individual and do their individual things, but their responsibility lies bigger because they're representing a bigger group. That's the biggest thing. And then really getting them to use their resources is the other thing. I think college has a lot of opportunities. We have free tutoring here. I tell them that we always have 4 or 5 geniuses in the bus. So utilize them. And, last year when we were traveling, it showed up with a couple freshmen. They were figuring out some mathematics problem they had in their class, and they were sitting behind me on the bus. And it took them, they were about 30 minutes into this one question that they couldn't solve. And they were just going in circles, round and round and round. And after a while, I was just like, wow, they are first years. And I looked at them like, guys, are you solving that problem? They're like, Coach, we're having a whole lot of trouble with it. I'm like, well, are you using the resources you have to solve the problem? They're like, we've been trying. I'm like, what resources do you have? And they're like, well, we have the book, we have our notes, we have this. And I was like, yes, but you forget that Charlie's on the bus. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, Charlie's a math genius. I'm like, he's 15 feet behind you. Go ask him. Charlie comes up. 2 minutes later, the problem's solved. I look back at him. I'm like, did we learn something today, boys? And they're like, we're sorry, Coach. We should have realized that. And it's just realizing that, it's problem solving. And there's a lot of problem solving to do in college. And sometimes we just have to guide their attention to finding the easiest paths as opposed to going through the brick wall, which often students do because they haven't thought about it differently or had resources similar before.
Yeah, and I think that just exposing people to resources and helping them understand that they don't have to do it all by themselves is crucial. One of the qualities that in the questionnaire that we've developed for match play, self-awareness and self-reliance and self-efficacy is all hugely important. And part of it is because you're going through a transition where most guys or most college athletes are moving out of their house. They don't have their parental support, right next door anymore. They're having to figure, like you said, some things out on their own. They're having to identify where their resources are and come up with strategies to leverage those resources. And so when we talk about all these individual qualities that we look for in a student athlete, I mean, do you think that those qualities that you were talking about, like being resourceful and being aware enough to know, like, I can't figure this out by myself, I need to find some help. Do you think are those things that you are able to evaluate through the lens of kind of the competitiveness and the drive and the responsibility you've already talked about? Or do you think that self-directedness and that self-regulation and self-awareness, is that a different category of stuff? Does that make sense?
I think in part of it, I see that self-directness is something I think most of them come with, self-directedness. I don't think they're savvy within that skill. I think they know how they've done it, and we're trying to put more tools in their toolbox to be able to solve more situations and think less linearly. I'll put it that way. So I think that's really the biggest thing, is just getting people to understand that, one of the things our team does, and this is, I'll relate this back to it, is everybody on my team writes a why I play essay. Okay. And it gets read to the team. So once a week we have somebody read their why I play essays, and us coaches have done it as well. And people essentially tell their soccer story. That's essentially what happens. So it's usually a 5 to 10 minute story of, I started playing like when I was this old and here's why I loved it. And then it changed as I grew up, and here's why I'm here today and what I want now and who I believe I am as a player right now. And so the stories that people have shared are awesome. Like, they're just awesome. But the backgrounds from which people come are so varied. It just opens up people's eyes so much. So those first years when they hear, where that junior and that senior have come from and what they're doing, and they've heard their path fully, and they've heard it 5 to 10 times over in their first freshman season, it kind of smacks them in the head in a really good way, because they're starting to realize that, whoa, that's a different path. He's been different places. Wow, he's looking at this entirely differently. And he's cool, but how do I relate to that? And how do I hug that in a way as a teammate? And I think that's something that comes back to it, is because they start seeing all their differences so much, and they start to understand really the true motivation that each player has to be there. They start to trust each other more and feel that, oh yeah, there are different ways to this same point. People have taken different paths to get here. And that, coupled with, we're very direct. I tell people, if any player has confusion as to what's expected from him at any point, that's both our faults, because communication's a two-way street. And I tell them, I promise I'll always have them working on 2 or 3 things, never more, never less. And I will always tell them how to go about it most efficiently and best. And if I can make that promise to them and keep it simple, then they understand they have the resource here. But if they get to the point of confusion, they have to understand, they have to ask the question. They can't just go into bewilderment and then be lost and now be ineffective in probably everything they're doing. So that's the time of just realizing is we're all here to solve a problem. So let's do it together. Mm-hmm. And it's a cool thing when you go to play college soccer. And I say this to recruits as well. Think about it. It's the only time in your life you have somebody whose full-time job is to help you reach your goals. That's awesome. Like, a lot of people don't get that ever in life. Yet, if you want to be the best player you can be, my full-time job is to help you do that and to support you doing that. And quite honestly, I'm your biggest cheerleader, because if you do that, I'm the happiest guy in the world. So it's really interesting that you got 4 years where you have somebody whose full-time job is to help you reach your goals. So maximize it, take advantage of it, and be very open and self-aware of it as you're realizing what you want and how to go about it. Because, when we graduate and we get into the real world, there's no other boss of any other company who's going to be focused on your goals. They're going to be focused on the company's goals, the business's goals, something other. So it's kind of cool that you have that, but I do think players or students, they need help figuring out how to take advantage of it and utilizing it best and making the most of that resource that they do have in the 4 years as well.
So when you talk about you've talked about some of the structures that you have in place that are just elements of your program, your mentorship program, your Why I Play essay, some of those things that you do that are just year in and year out, consistently part of your philosophy and how you go about doing business. So some of those, a lot of those are the structures put in place by the staff, and it's kind of supervised or monitored by the staff, and you guys sort of guide that process. What types of things, as players develop in your program, certainly for young players, it's difficult to put a lot of that responsibility on their shoulders for guiding the group or for the way the group goes about its business. So as you get to those juniors and seniors who are sharing their Why I Play essays, and they're sort of having this initial impact on the younger players and widening their perspective potentially, how do you leverage that connectedness within your group, and what qualities do you see in those older leaders that, or how do they take on the responsibility of building on something like a Why I Play essay session? Like, where does it go from there with your older players and your younger players?
there's a few different ways that it goes, and one is we have summer reading as well, so people have to read books and they have to do a play and report in book report form in our meetings afterwards, except seniors who get to choose any TED Talks they want and then present them and give something why. What the seniors present always just amazes me because they come up with stuff that's just cool, and what they're trying to stress to the young guys. And it's the first meeting on the first day, so the first years really get it from the seniors right from the start with TED Talks that are personalized. An example, a few years back, we had a player who he lost his brother when he was in college, and it was very hard for him. And he chose to come back to school and finish and play his senior year. And so he was doing his TED Talk, and he put up Simon Sinek. And he's like, whatever you're doing, you must ask why. Every day, ask yourself why. And he just was very straight and directed, and he had a presence to him that was pretty cool. And so he goes over it, and he's like, I had never asked myself why about anything in life until I had to write the essay here. And now when I've gone through this loss and the devastation of my family, I ask why about every single thing I do. And it's like, so right there we have it set up to give them something. As before we get to that point where they're seniors, with our captains, the players vote for captains and they have to tell us why they're voting for captains as well. But when we choose the captains have 6 months of weekly meetings with us coaches when they accept the captaincy roles. And it's quite honestly very little to do with soccer. A great deal to do with personality, communication, leadership, balancing roles, understanding their form of leadership. So not trying to be the captain that they respected most or someone else what they think is a captain. And then how they can collaborate their skills to get the whole job done. So we try to get them to understand, one, their style of communication and leadership, but two, then let's let them all do their most enjoyable things. And then if there's other stuff, we'll share the load of the stuff that nobody's finding enjoyable and make sure it's not a burden to any one individual. So those guys, they get a lot of, there's no one right way to do it training, I guess is the way to put it. Because
that's a tough acronym, but yeah, that makes sense.
So I think that's a big thing. And then we also break out our team into subgroups by captain. So I list all the players on the board, and I just have them use different colors and put a star next to each person they feel really comfortable being a leader with and having a relationship with. And then so if we have 3 or 4 captains, each person will get 6 or 7 guys that they're directly in charge of. So if I see somebody on the team who's just out of sorts, the first person that I will ask is that captain who's in charge of that person of what's going on. And then we'll facilitate sort of helping the player from there. But they know that whether it be good things or like whether rewarding comments or reinforcement comments or punitive comments or things like that they're in charge of those players.
So we do, in terms of leadership at William and Mary, it's very similar in the philosophical sense that there's no one way to do this. And, we try to take a really good inventory of the qualities or the attributes that a particular leader brings and try to maximize the impact that those values are going to have or those attributes are going to have within the group. And having a balance within your captain group, having a good balance is important. You can't have 4 guys who are, for lack of a better term, drill sergeants and, kind of take that very black and white approach or that zero defect approach. But you also can't have 4 guys who are just, really nurturing and understanding and, maybe lack a little bit of the personality to hold guys accountable in difficult moments. So as I've gone through the process of, interviewing and selecting leaders, our process is somewhat similar aside from actually designating captains. I found myself, I'm surprised sometimes by, from the recruiting process, I evaluate a certain player and I think I have a pretty decent idea of what their personality is and what they're going to bring. And then, maybe through their application essay for the leadership program or something like that, I get some insight, or I get a little bit of an idea of something they maybe bring to the group that I wouldn't have known, just based on the recruiting process. Or it might have taken me 2 or 3 years of having them in the program to really get that attribute that they have, or to really understand that, hey, this is something that the group can really use, or that they can really add to what we have going on here. So my question is, do you find that you're often surprised, like when the team votes on captains, for instance, and you go, okay, these 3 guys make sense, this guy, like I didn't see it before, based on the recruiting process or based on your interactions with them up to that point? Do you guys have kind of hidden attributes and things that maybe are really hard to evaluate in the recruiting process, but then really blossom once they get to your program?
I think it's an interesting question because, I believe that basically all good things in life are time dependent. And what I mean by that is, say you meet a significant other. You can meet a significant other at a certain time period of life, and it can be a wonderful match. Whereas if you had met that person 10 years earlier, you probably wouldn't have been together. And that sort of relates to what you're talking about, is sometimes it's just people get it. When they're a junior, something clicks in them and they just show a different character or a different way of being. And I think that's one of the most interesting things that I enjoy about coaching, quite honestly, is because you see a different person graduate than who comes in, because they go through all these different changes. But it was one thing that was interesting. We had a player that an entire freshman class voted for, which had never happened before. And he was going to be a senior, and every single freshman voted for him. And everyone wrote the same thing in why. He checked with me every day to see how I was and really cared about me. And when I talked to that freshman class, they said, look, literally every day of preseason and every day of practice, he came up to me personally and said, how are you today? How are you doing? And he meant it. And it was really interesting because this player also was 2 X's into his 3 X's. So one part was, I was like, wow, I didn't know he was doing that. That's really awesome. And the other part was, ooh, he gets another X. This is a blemish on the program like no other. So
right.
That became an interesting thing. And I never would have known that he was, going to be the group leader in that fashion, or that he was just minded in a way to care that much and do that. So for him, it became a real big conversation. I didn't make him a captain. I talked to him about the responsibility he had if he were to be captain, and if I should dare to make him captain given his 2 strikes. Because we had a lot of talks about what he did to get those strikes as well. So it's just something where, in his case, we made him a captain and he did a marvelous job. And some of the stupid things he did when he was a first year and a second year, he didn't exemplify anymore his junior and senior year, because I think he got scared well enough that he was going to get kicked out of school that he didn't do it. But also, he kind of started realizing the importance of the team and his brothers in a way, is the way he would explain them. But I think I don't know, I keep an open mind as we go through the process, because I don't expect to always know what guys are going to turn out like. And I think it's pretty cool. Some guys develop in different ways, and their roles on the team, it's really interesting to see how they react to them. So we have seniors who've come back after not having played much, and they'll come back senior year more enthusiastic and excited and happy on the field than anything I've ever seen. And I admire that greatly. I've seen guys do that, and I'm just like, that's awesome. Like, you're in better shape. You're hungrier. You're doing everything because you're like, no, I want to give myself my best chance. And I think that's really cool. Then I had another player who, he had a choice of reversion back to his high school playing style because he was so frustrated because he wasn't playing well. And we had a talk about it. And I said, we were making gains on this, and then you started just taking more touches and going willy-nilly all the time. He says to me, he goes, yeah, I think about in October, I just said, what the heck? And I just started playing soccer the way I had when I was in high school because that's when I had my most fun. So I was just trying to have fun. And I was like, at the same point, you weren't doing anything that we were asking you to do as coaches. And he's like, yeah. I'm like, and he's an awesome person. And I said to him, like, look, I like talking to you. It's fun. Like, I really value our conversations. But isn't it fair to say you're uncoachable? And he looked at me with a smirk. He's like, yeah, that's a fair statement. And I was like, is that who you want to be? Like, this is literally our conversation. I'm like, is that who you want to be? And he's like, no, I don't want to be that guy. And so we talked for another 20 minutes and sort of go out. And I remember my assistant coach at the time looked at me. He's like, you knew you were going to call him uncoachable when he came in. He basically just defined his behavior as uncoachable. And then you got him smiling and feeling valued when he left the door after you called him uncoachable. And that meeting was to tell him he needed a huge behavior change. Well, I know he doesn't want to be that person. And it goes back to, I got to help him be the best person he can be. And whether it's on the field or off the field, he doesn't want to be that person who doesn't take feedback and doesn't work on it.
Here's what I'm really interested in. With that particular player, if you can remember the recruiting process, did this 180 to become more uncoachable, or the reversion, as you mentioned, was that something that you always had in the back of your mind that it might go this direction? Was there any indication of that in the recruiting process?
I would say yes. And the reason I would say yes is because he came from a small club in not a big soccer area. So he wasn't in a training situation that was challenging every day. He was often the best on the field. And, he was the big fish in the small pond. And through my recruiting him, he was inconsistent as a player. When he was good, he could be really, really good. But I didn't think he knew how to prepare himself daily to be good every day. So that was one of the big things we were trying to work on with him, is to understand what he was good at and bring it every day. And I think that was a longer road for him to get there than the average person. And I think his senior year was by far his best season. And I wish it had been his junior year, quite honestly. His path just took longer. But that's one of the things that it's, as people are coming from, say, smaller club situations or less competitive club situations, I always think it's a little bit more of a random guess.
Look, we've all been there in the recruiting process where we're sitting there and you're trying to figure out, are we making an offer? Are we not making an offer? And you're parsing every tiny little piece of information that you've been able to gather, and you're still, I don't know. I just don't know. And you're not sure why you're making the decision. And, some of the approach, like with this instrument that Scott and I have created, is to try to just add another tiny data point. It's certainly not going to be the central component of your recruiting process or any college coach's recruiting process, but having maybe just one more somewhat objective data point to say, we're on the fence about this guy, but hey, I can point to, this particular attribute, something that maybe is really important in your program. Like you mentioned, the self-directedness or the responsibility or being driven or motivated or, something like that, hey, he scores a little bit higher here than some of these other guys that I've recruited in the past, or some of these guys I've had in my program. And does that extra little data point tip the scales a little bit, or does it give me just a tiny bit more confidence that not necessarily that he's going to come in and blow it away right away, but that by the time he's a junior or a senior, some of these qualities, if we do a good job as a staff, some of these qualities will come to the fore. We'll start to see those things a little more consistently, that type of thing. So that's kind of what, as we're talking about this, talking about these attributes that we're able to evaluate with young players, it's often about fine margins, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not, you never go through the recruiting process and go, yeah, these are our top 10 guys. We got all 10 of them. Next, right? Like, let's get ready for the fall season. It's always, you always come down to some of these really small margins in terms of actually making decisions on players, as I'm sure they do on the other end when they're making decisions on programs. So that kind of wraps up for me in terms of like the stuff I wanted to pick your brain about and some of the connections. So I'm going to pass it over to Scott and see if he wants what he has to add.
Man, I'm exhausted. I mean, you guys, no, I'm kidding. So one thing that came to mind while you were talking, Mike, was I know you both are very thoughtful guys, and like when you have kids come in, and I'm sure that you're really, really good at not just evaluating them on the field, but kind of what's going on in between their ears and that sort of thing. And most coaches, I'm sure, will have some sort of plan to, this is where I see the player arc going and that sort of thing. And Mike, but either one of you, but we'll start with Mike. But like, are you guys devising plans to develop them as leaders and people? And you've talked about the self-directedness, and you cleverly got that kid to agree that he was uncoachable at that point. And so was that a strategy of yours from some observations you made once he was on campus, or was that just something that you came up with in the moment, or are you really thoughtful about where identifying potential and then developing kids into that through self-directedness and that sort of thing? It's a long question.
I think it's interesting. Like, I really do look at every person that I bring in, and I chose my word very carefully there, because I do look at them as people first before I think of them as players. And for me, it's my job to try to motivate them and get them to figure out how they can succeed most. So the communication style is different with every player. And I said that I say that in the original meeting we have at the beginning of the year as well. And a guy who's just graduated, who is also a 2-year captain, he's like, yeah, I remember when you said that when I was a freshman and I thought it was BS. And I was like, oh yeah? He's like, I'll be honest with you. You don't talk to anyone like you talk to me. He's like, you ask me to do things and challenge me in certain ways that you don't with my best friends. And I'm like, yeah, because you're you. And I think that comes into it. A big part is I think coaches really do have the responsibility to make sure that they're attending to each person individually. And if we do so, I think it's healthy, but it's humane, and it's professional of us to do so. So I'm going to try to do that as much as I can. And I think it's something that when guys are getting that direct feedback that they know is personal and they understand it's not generic or universal in a way, they start to value it and expect it and treat each other that way too, because it almost sets a tone of, no, it's not a secret. We're all trying to be the best players we can on the field. So don't be sensitive about it. We're just trying to get it done, trying to be good. That's what we're in the business of, being good. So let's be good together and figure it out. And if we can take away some of that sensitivity and that defensiveness and the worry that they have, I think it raises the ceiling of everybody much greater.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're really talking about being vulnerable, and, there's definitely a negative connotation sometimes with being vulnerable, but it's the way you, like, how do you guide them into being vulnerable for the benefit of the team? I mean, you have them write an essay that they have the option of being vulnerable in that, but how do you encourage that so that they grow together as a cohesive, team?
I think it's an interesting, I'll say, push and pull to it in a way. Okay, so obviously when you're a head coach or an assistant coach, there are different roles that come with each of those positions. And you would think of assistant coaches being more personable or more friendly than head coaches can afford to be, right? So I think in a way I have to keep a distance from being considered a buddy or a friend. And I need to do that. But at the same point, I think that doesn't mean I have to appear to be unfallible or not having humility myself. And if I show my vulnerability as well, then I think it disarms it from the guys, because they can still have respect for the head coach in the manner I think they need to. But I'm a person, and I know the way that they look at their coaches, that if I show that vulnerability, that it's going to resonate with them. They're going to see it. And it's going to be impactful in a way. They're not going to miss that. They're going to understand what it is.
Right.
And I remember it was a couple years ago, we were playing a game, and it was the anniversary of my mom's passing. And I talked to the team about it and how important it was to me in the locker room before the game. After that, guys just came up, hugging after the game. She would have liked that coach, stuff like that. And it was just something where I was like, yeah, I think I need to share this with them, because this is something in me right now that I need to feel. And I think true moments like that, genuine moments, not that you have a whole bunch of them, but if they come up every once in a while, I don't know, it kind of becomes the culture, because it's 360. I'm not asking them to be vulnerable and not willing to sort of be that myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I'm sure that was quite a moment for you and your guys. That was probably pretty cool. So, and the other thing is that you've built in these layers of leadership. You've given kids, young men, the opportunity to be vulnerable with several different layers, and you got the mentor program, and that starts even before they step foot on campus, and then layers. I was thinking when you were talking about it that it kind of sounds a little military chain of command kind of thing, but I'm sure it has that purpose, but there's a lot more to it as well than just passing down and passing up information. It's kind of a checks and balances system. What made you decide to take that route and install that kind of framework within your organization?
I just think that, like, groups, at least in my experience, groups benefit from having some structures that are comfortable in a way. And by using these different tools, whether it be the mentorship or the books or whatever it is, directing their attention to the most important things is kind of important.
Mm-hmm.
And making it in group form gives them comfort, so they don't have to do anything solo, which they really value. So I think I don't know, those things, it's interesting. I was working at an ID camp where there was about 20 college coaches there, and talking with one who's a good peer, sort of competitor of mine. And he's like, "Did I hear that you make your kids read books in the summer?" And I was like, "Yeah." And like, he was blown away. He's like, "What are you trying to get done?" And I'm like, trying to get them to learn. And it's just, to me, it's, it's great that we have wins and everything, but there's so much that sport teaches that's so beyond X's and O's. And to be successful, I think you need to know a lot of other stuff than the perfect pass, the exquisite finish. And I think that's kind of why we go about it, because I do believe there's a lot more to being a successful athlete than just being technically skillful on a ball. So we try to cover that in varied ways. And alums tell us they should have found it valuable. So we ask alums regularly about like what they would change, in our senior meetings, what they would change in their experience and how they would switch it and what they valued. And that stuff, they often say they really enjoyed it and valued it. So they suggest not changing it. So once they come back and say, yeah, it's stale now, we need to do something different, we'll change it. But right now it seems that they're valuing it.
So as an aside question, what are some of the top books that you've had you guys read? Do they change every summer, or?
Oh yeah. The first book they read is a wooden book, a pyramid book on wooden and philosophy of coaching and his pyramid stuff. The second is The Champion's Mind by Jim Aftermath. Sophomores have to read that. And then juniors have the extra burden of reading Who Moved My Cheese, which I call it's a short read, but the plays are phenomenal.
I'm not familiar.
It'll take you about a half hour to read it. It's a good one.
Yeah, I think I read it years ago. It's actually really cool. But yeah, just to clarify, we are not talking about Justin Chesum.
No. See, it's the funniest one because, people would think, oh, I'm going to get this like encyclopedic sports psych book or something to give them and make them really study and do this. And this thing's like a 50-page little thing, but it's what I found really resonates with them. And essentially it's like, if they've had success the first couple of years and they don't change, they stop growing, then they're not going to have continued success. So they got to figure out it's not how we did it last year. It's each year we got to add something and be different and better. And that's kind of why I use that book.
Yeah. Brendan, did you guys have read books at some point?
We've done a few different things with our leadership group in the past. In terms of the entire team, we've done growth mindset. We've had the whole team, got copies of that for the whole team at various times. Within my leadership groups, I've done Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last, I think and me coming from a little bit of, having a military background, some of the stuff in Leaders Eat Last, because he does work with a lot of military groups and a lot of the lessons he gleans, which are generalizable, certainly, but they do come from his experience with some of those groups. They really hit home for me and resonate with me. So maybe I'm just projecting that onto my group, but that's one that I definitely I'm drawn toward. And the other one we did last year was a book called Extreme Ownership, which is, again, written by a couple Navy SEALs. So there you go. But concepts, I find I have to caveat it early on. I say, okay, guys, we're going to read a book called Extreme Ownership. It's written by these two guys who are Navy SEALs. You can look up their careers. They've done some wild stuff, in their lives. But I want you guys to try and distill the lessons out of this and try to contextualize it for where you are in your life and where our team is right now. Because if you try to behave towards your teammates the same way a Navy SEAL platoon commander would, we're probably not going to get too far. And so I like it for that reason as well. I think the lessons are crucial. The idea of always thinking about the group before you think about yourself when it comes to Leaders Eat Last. And the idea of owning everything that happens in your program. Not saying that you can control everything, but the idea that you own everything in your program, from the staff down to, every single player owns what they're doing within our program. And so I think those concepts basically are are really cornerstones for what we're trying to do in our program. And like I said, I always have to try to contextualize the book for them and make sure that, I'm not telling you to behave like a Navy SEAL or like an Air Force pilot or anything like that. I'm telling you, think about what you can draw from this and put into your context and will be useful there. So those are the two recently that I think I've really kind of settled on as being really helpful with our leadership groups.
Yeah.
I think too, there's a second part to it. Like whenever we give readings or anything, it's how do we get processing done after they have whatever work it is. And that's something where at the start here, I would just say, okay, now you guys have to present as classes for your book. And, it's PowerPoint, everything, which is so boring. So that's why they do plays now, because I'm like, no, you got to have some fun with it and be creative and figure out how to speak. Like those things that Brendan was just saying, what he wants them to glean from the book. If they're having to act it out or do it, they're kind of looking for those things a little bit more than just reporting as an academic on it.
Right.
And I found it always creates good laughs, which is great. But they come up with some pretty creative ways to present different things they glean from the books.
Yeah, you don't want them necessarily acting out Navy SEAL things in their presentation.
It would be actually kind of funny to see some of the guys on my team try it.
You gotta be kind of careful. Yeah.
So when we're recording this, it's getting ready to be preseason. You guys are days away from the start of your training and then matches. It's remarkable to me how quickly you guys have matches right after you start, after guys report. But and I was just kind of wondering, like if someone's just graduated and they're getting ready to report for their first season, it's a really tough go that first year, especially. I'm sure that you got 6 days a week and you have 2 games a week a lot of times for several months. I mean, it's the hardest they've ever been pushed in their lives, I would guess. So kind of from a preparation standpoint, it's obvious that they need to be fit. It's obvious that they need to hone their soccer skills, but you guys, I would be foolish not to ask you how they should prepare on a mental side for a long, tough season where they're new to everything and they're trying to figure out how to be a student at, especially with you guys, 2 really tough schools. How do they kind of? I mean, Mike, it's awesome that you have the mentor program, but I mean, they still are going to get hit in the face when they walk on campus, right?
No, I just think it's just having regular checkpoints. Like even in the preseason plan, like we have built in times where we're going to have, a cookout in my backyard, or we're going to do something fun as a team, or we're going to a restaurant instead of going to dining services, or trying to get them to do things to, I don't know, get them out of that and just as part of a team and not having to think of all the worries that they have as a student and a person attending college for the first time as well. And then we have regular meetings throughout the season as well, where we're checking in and asking those questions about how everything's going, and making sure that we're aware. I know at least here for the first year, I actually get their midterm grade as well, which helps me. And anybody knows that if they have anything below a B, that we have a mandatory meeting and we'll talk proactively about how to try to raise that grade. So there's a lot of just checkpoints built into the system, I think, just to aid them with whatever they might be seeing, thinking, feeling, because it is unique to each individual. And it's funny, I just find making sure that conversation is regular is the best way to just make sure nothing gets too drastic.
Yeah, I think for preparation, it's hard you can't replicate what it's going to be like to be in preseason. You can train twice a day at home. You can do all that kind of stuff. I think one of the most important things for me, and what I think pays off the most when you first get on a college campus, is if you've been in situations where you failed before. And sometimes you don't have a ton of control over that as a youth player. Like Mike was talking about, having a player who was basically the best player on the field most of the time, in his youth career. And, you can learn things from succeeding, certainly. But it's a well-used, well-worn trope that, you learn more from failure. And so I would encourage young players to try and find ways to put yourself in tough situations, not legally or anything like that, but, tough situations on the field, tough situations in the classroom. When you have a choice between doing something that you're comfortable with and something that you're not sure about, can you find a way to do the thing that you're not sure about? Because that, I think, pays off hugely, especially early in your college career, when being uncomfortable is not the worst thing in the world for you. Not knowing what's going on, you can still function, when you don't know exactly what's going on, or you don't know exactly what the right answer is, or exactly how to proceed in a particular situation. So that's a little bit of a philosophical answer, I guess, to the question. Mike's was definitely more concrete, but that would be my take on it, or my advice to young players, if they can do that.
Yeah. You guys create, I know the answer to this, but I mean, how do you guys create pressure situations during training and that sort of thing? And how are you expecting your players to react? And, Mike, when you see them not quite reacting the way you would hope they would, how are you handling that and, kind of guiding them through where they felt like they did fail and didn't handle the pressure?
Mm-hmm. Well, every activity we play in practice, there's a winner and a loser. Everything's competitive and it's measured. So they know after every activity if they've performed well, quite honestly, and they get punished if they lose. So they know that too. So there's nothing secret about it. And I lean on the upperclassmen a lot to make sure they're not losing 2 games in a row, and making sure that, if you go through a practice and you've done 4 activities and you're on the losing side of every activity, well, that's a failure of the day. So we talk about, as we go through, we'll try to get them to understand, okay, well, what do you need to do different? Like, how do you go back if we do this again? How are you guys going to operate differently as a group in order to not be on the losing side of this? And I often say that I think the players, as they come to us at college, they're trained in cereal box answers. And what I mean by that is, if we ask them questions, they're typically coming back with, play it wide, open up the field. Like, to anything you ask them, they just spit out what they've been coached over and over and over. And we try to make sure we're having very, specific communication. No, this field is this, and this is a task. So how do you do best here? Let's walk it through step by step to exactly what you execute in order to win this game. And start to try to train them to start thinking about, whenever they get into an activity, how do they win it? And I think that's part of what happens to the younger guys through preseason, is they start figuring out that we don't want them just to play good. We want them to figure out how to win and figure out how to be competitive in that way.
Brendan, you got anything to add to that?
Pretty similar. I think keeping things competitive and providing opportunities, sometimes making an exercise too difficult, where they're not going to find the answer right away. And it's going to take them, they're going to get frustrated, and they're going to get frustrated with each other, and they might get frustrated with the staff, and they might feel like we've been set up for failure. And we might say, yeah, you have been. And we're looking to see how you respond to that type of situation. Like, what type of resilience do you have when things aren't going well? When you're frustrated as a group, do you pull apart or do you pull together? Those are the types of things that we're trying to train and try to, first of all, just to make them aware of it. Like, hey, you got really frustrated and you did this. Did you even realize it? Did you see it happening? Because sometimes the awareness isn't even there. You say, oh, did I did I make that face? Did I say that to that guy? Was my body language like that? And you go, yeah, I was watching you the whole time. And so just creating those moments where they can become aware of how they respond to difficult situations and frustration. And then from there, as Mike was talking about, sort of discussing why the failure occurred, and how do we set ourselves up in the future to overcome that adversity without failing first. And those types of things are all, I think we do probably similar things within our programs to try to build those muscles, if you will, being able to overcome difficult situations.
Yeah. And failure is kind of creating moments of leadership too for some players.
You hope.
Yeah. Kind of, then who's going to be your leaders. So we're at an hour, and I want to be respectful of you guys' time. So did I miss anything? Anything else that, I know you guys are a wealth of knowledge, so anything else you want to throw in there to close it out?
Mike and I haven't had a chance to chat in a while, so this was really fun, and I got to pick his brain again, so I'm all fired up again.
See, like he brought up some things that sort of, I think, like something that he'll love is, as he was talking about his books and stuff like that, it comes down to knowing what you don't know is the most important thing to know in life. And the more we can expose players to being real with themselves about that, they'll succeed in everything they do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep. For sure. All right. Anything else?
I'm good.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys.